What if the image of the free and indomitable Highlander, with his flowing kilt and sword in hand, is one of the greatest and most successful fictions in history? We have been taught to admire a romantic fantasy, but the truth is that behind the tartan and the bagpipes, there is a story of betrayal, ethnic cleansing, and cultural annihilation that has been conveniently forgotten. The Highlander's greatest virtue, his unshakable loyalty, was precisely the weapon used to bring him to ruin. This is not a story of heroes dying gloriously. It is the chronicle of how one of the most feared warrior peoples of Europe was systematically dismantled, not by a foreign conqueror, but by their own leaders and the cold logic of profit. In this documentary, we will tear back the veil of romance and expose the brutal truth. You are about to discover how loyalty to a charismatic prince led to a massacre, and how the laws that banned an entire culture paved the way for millions to be driven from their ancestral lands to make way for sheep. How did the symbols of their rebellion ironically become the costume of choice for the very elite who crushed them? The answer is a shocking and moving journey that will forever change the way you see Scotland. If you believe that the real story, unfiltered, is the one that deserves to be told, then join us on this journey. Your subscription to the channel and your like on this video are not just numbers. They are fundamental support to ensure that more powerful sagas like this are not lost to time. By sharing, you help us spread knowledge and honor the memory of a people whose history was almost erased. Tell us in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories can travel. And if there is another story, another people, or event you are yearning to understand, your suggestion could be our next great investigation. Before distant kings, contested crowns, and the steel of cannons that would rip history apart, there was the land. The Scottish Highlands in the mid-17th century were not just a place on a map, but a kingdom forged by ice and time, a labyrinth of mountains whose peaks scratched at a perpetually gray sky and glens so deep they seemed to hold the secrets of creation itself. This was not the orderly world of Edinburgh or the distant metropolis of London. This was a universe apart, a bastion of ancient tradition, governed not by laws written on parchment, but by a code of honor etched into the souls of its people, the Highlanders. To understand their saga, one must first understand their world, a world of brutal beauty and profound isolation. The mountains, called Munros and Corbetts, were not just geographical barriers. They were the walls of a natural fortress that separated the Gaels of the Highlands from their lowland neighbors. This separation was not merely physical, it was cultural, linguistic, and spiritual. To the south, the people spoke Scots, a Germanic language, and society was increasingly organized around commerce and a feudal structure closer to the European model. Here in the north, the heart beat to the sound of Gaelic, an ancient Celtic language, and loyalty was not given to an abstract concept of nation, but to something far more tangible and powerful: blood, family, the clan. Life here was a constant dance with the elements. The wind howled through the glens like a restless spirit, bringing with it torrential rains and snowstorms that could isolate a community for weeks. The soil, thin and rocky, offered only the most basic sustenance. To live in the Highlands was to be resilient by necessity. The houses, known as black houses, were low-slung constructions of stone and turf with thatched roofs designed to withstand the gales. Humans and animals often shared the same roof during the harsh winters, a testament to the symbiosis between the people and their land. The scent of peat smoke was the constant perfume of home, a comforting presence against the biting cold. Life was shaped by this reality. The land was not something to be conquered, but a powerful and sometimes implacable partner with whom survival had to be negotiated each day. It was this isolation and this daily struggle that forged the character of the Highlander, fiercely independent, distrustful of outsiders, and unshakably loyal to their own. They were a people who understood that survival depended on the strength of the community, of the neighbor, of the kin. It was a world where a man's word was his honor, and honor was more valuable than life itself. And at the center of this universe of loyalty and survival was the institution that defined everything: the clan. Forget for a moment the serene mist and the silent glens. Transport yourself to April 16, 1746. The place is Culloden Moor, a desolate, windswept bog near Inverness. The air does not smell of burning peat, but of gunpowder, of fear, and of imminent death. On one side, the British Army, a disciplined and well-fed war machine, arranged in perfect lines of redcoats. Their bronze cannons, polished and deadly, point east. On the other side, scattered across the soggy moor, are the men of the clans. They are exhausted, starving, and outnumbered. Many have barely slept, having come from a failed night march. Their faces, weathered by time and hunger, are turned into the sleet and rain that blinds them. Their stomachs are empty, but their hearts burn with an ancient loyalty and a desperate hope. And then, hell begins. The British cannons open fire. It is not a battle of elegant maneuvers, it is an industrial slaughter. The grape-shot clusters of musket balls packed into a canister explodes from the mouths of the cannons and cuts through the air like a giant scythe. It rips through the clan ranks, opening up clearings of death and mutilation. Men who were neighbors, brothers, and fathers fall screaming, their bodies dismembered before they even have a chance to draw their swords. The tartan, the symbol of their pride, becomes a blood-soaked shroud in the frigid bog. For an excruciating time, they endure. They wait for the order, the one tactic they truly know and trust, the Highland charge. And then it comes. With a guttural war cry that echoes through generations of warriors, clade him, more. They advance. Thousands of men, wielding broadswords, targes shields, and Lacaber axes, run desperately across the swampy ground toward the red lines that spit fire and death. It is a vision of primal courage and tragic futility. They are the embodiment of an ancient world colliding head-on with the brutality of modern warfare. Their wooden and leather shields try to stop steel bayonets. Their swords, made for individual and heroic combat, search for a target amidst an impenetrable wall of military discipline. For a brief, glorious moment, a part of the British line gives way. But the war machine recomposes itself, fires one last volley at point-blank range, and the clan war cry turns into a death wail. In less than an hour, it is all over. The field is covered with bodies. The pride of the clans is broken. An entire culture is on its knees, bleeding into the mud of Culloden. How? How did a people defined by their strength and loyalty, who lived in harmony with their untamable land, arrive at this bog to be annihilated? The answer lies not in the mud of Culloden, but in the centuries that preceded it. To understand this end, we must go back to the beginning. We must understand the soul of the Highlander, the structure that sustained him, and the chain of events that dragged him, inevitably, to this day of annihilation. To the outside world, especially to the orderly minds of London, the Highland clan system was a dangerous anachronism, a barbaric relic of a forgotten time. But for the Highlander, the clan was not a structure, it was the very fabric of existence. The Gaelic word clan means children or descendants, and this literal definition was the key to everything. The clan was not a political alliance, but a vast extended family, bound by ties of blood, real or assumed, to a common ancestor. And at the pulsating heart of this family was the figure of the chief. The clan chief was not a mere landlord, as was understood in the lowlands. He was the pater familias, the living embodiment of the clan's lineage and honor. His authority did not emanate from a royal decree, but from a profound Gaelic concept called Duth Case, hereditary right, not just to the land, but to the people. The land did not belong to him as private property. It belonged to the clan, and he was its guardian, its protector. In return, he received the unquestioning loyalty of his kinsmen. This loyalty, called fine, was the mortar that held the social edifice together. To betray the chief was more than a crime. It was heresy, an act against nature itself, a betrayal of one's own family and ancestors. His role was multifaceted. He was the supreme judge, settling disputes with a wisdom that balanced tradition and practical justice. He was the general who led his men in battle, not from the rear but from the front line where the danger was greatest. His bravery was the mirror of his clan's bravery. He was also the provider. In times of famine, the chief was expected to open his own granaries to feed his people. A chief's wealth was measured not by the gold in his coffers, but by the number of men he could summon to a feast or to war. Within the clan, there was a clear hierarchy. Below the chief were the chieftains, who governed smaller sections of the territory. Below them were the tacksmen, the gentry of the clan, who leased large portions of land from the chief and sublet them to the common clansmen. They formed the officer class in the clan's army. and at the base were the clansmen, the tenants who farmed the land, raised the cattle, and formed the backbone of the clan's military might. Even the humblest clansman felt a sense of belonging and dignity. He was not a serf. He was a kinsman, however distant, of his chief. This system created a formidable and instantaneous fighting force. When the chief sent the fiery cross, a wooden cross, burned and dipped in goats, blood from village to village, it was a call that could not be ignored. In a matter of days, an army of loyal men, hardened to adversity and proficient with the sword and shield, could materialize from the mists of the glens. It was this capacity for rapid mobilization and this fierce loyalty that made the clans a force to be feared. Far from the halls of chiefs and political machinations, life for the common Highlander was a daily battle, not against enemy armies, but against the land itself. Existence in the glens was defined by a relentless cycle of seasons, and by the hard labor required to wrench a living from a soil that was, at best, reluctant. Agriculture was rudimentary and challenging. The main crop was oats, and to a lesser extent barley, planted in small arable fields known as run rigs. These were long, narrow strips of land, often worked communally using wooden plows. Oats were the basis of everything. They formed the porridge that fueled the day's work and the bannocks flatbreads that accompanied it. But the true measure of wealth, the beating heart of the Highland economy, was not in the soil, but on the pastures. Cattle were the currency. Cows, especially the hardy black Highland breeds, were a clan's primary asset. They provided milk, cheese, butter, leather, and, on special occasions, meat. More importantly, they were a mobile asset. In an environment where crops could fail catastrophically, a herd of cattle represented security. Disputes over grazing lands were a constant source of tension, and owning a large herd was a sign of prestige and power. Annually, great herds were driven south on long journeys to be sold in lowland markets, bringing in the little hard cash that circulated in the region. Interdependence was the key to survival. No family could thrive alone. Work in the fields was communal. Building a new house was a collective effort, and the defense of the village was everyone's responsibility. Solitude was rare. Life was lived in public, within a web of mutual obligations and support. If a family's harvest failed, neighbors were expected to share. If a man died, the community would look after his widow and children. This social cohesion was reinforced by the long winter nights. With outdoor work made impossible by darkness and cold, families would gather around the peat fire in the center of their homes. It was then that the oral culture flourished. Elders told the stories of the clan's great heroes, the battles won, the genealogies that connected everyone present to their chief and to the mythic past. Songs and poems were recited from memory. This was how identity was forged and passed down. Every child grew up knowing who they were, where they came from, and to whom they owed loyalty. Life could be brutally hard. Infant mortality was high, and famine a constant threat. But it was not a life of despair. It was an existence imbued with a deep sense of place, belonging, and a rich culture that gave meaning to every sacrifice. If the clan system was the skeleton of Highlander society, Gaelic culture was its soul. The blood that ran through its veins and gave life and color to an otherwise gray and harsh world. This culture was not a pastime or a luxury. It was the lens through which the world was seen and understood. And at the center of it all was the language. Scottish Gaelic, a Celtic language of immense antiquity and complexity, was more than a means of communication. It was a repository of history, folklore, and practical knowledge about the land. The names of places were not mere labels. They were poems in themselves, describing the shape of a hill, the story of a battle fought there, or the type of animal that inhabited it. To speak Gaelic was to carry the mental and spiritual map of the Highlands. To lose the language would be like becoming blind and lost in one's own home. Music was omnipresent, as natural as breathing. There were the work songs or walking songs, sung by women in a strong, driving rhythm as they beat newly woven woolen cloth. There were laments, love songs, and ballads that told tales of fairies and ghosts. And of course, there was the sound that would become the sonic emblem of Scotland to the world, the great Highland bagpipe, the peapob MHR in its origin. This was not an instrument for parades. It was an instrument of war. Its piercing, haunting sound was used to rally the clan, to instill courage in the hearts of warriors, and to terrorize the enemy. Each clan had its own pibrochs, complex compositions that commemorated historical events or mourned the death of a chief. A skilled piper was a figure of immense prestige. But the most sacred task of cultural preservation fell to the bards and the scene-shidden oral historians. In a society where literacy was the domain of a few clerics, history was an oral treasure, passed down with remarkable accuracy from generation to generation. The bards were not simple storytellers. They were highly trained intellectuals, masters of poetic meter and genealogy. A bard at a chief's court was expected to be able to recite his patron's lineage for hundreds of years, linking him to the mythic kings of Scotland and Ireland. They composed epic poems that glorified the deeds of the chief and the clan, ensuring that acts of bravery were never forgotten. Their words could immortalize a hero or destroy an enemy's reputation. They were the guardians of collective memory. This oral culture created a shared reality, a tapestry of myths, legends, and history that bound the clan together. Each member felt part of a continuing saga. He wasn't just Ewan the farmer. He was Ewan of Clan Cameron, whose great-grandfather had fought alongside Lahil in a legendary battle that the bards still sang about. This deep identity, rooted in language, music, and shared history, was the source of immense strength and unshakable pride. To the legalistic and orderly mind of the lowlands, the Highlander was, in essence, a thief, an outlaw who descended from the mountains to plunder and steal. And indeed, cattle raiding was an endemic part of life in the Highlands, but what the outside world saw as mere banditry was, for the Highlander, an ancient, complex, and socially sanctioned institution known by the Gaelic name Creech. The Creech was not the furtive act of a lone thief. It was a small-scale military operation, a rite of passage for young men, and a vital cog in the machine of clan economics and politics. The motivation for a cattle raid was multifaceted. The most obvious was economic. In a land where crops were uncertain, a herd of cattle stolen from a rival clan could mean the difference between plenty and starvation during a harsh winter. But the Creech was about much more than economics. It was a matter of honor. A successful raid was a demonstration of strength, cunning, and courage. A young man who participated in his first Creech in return successfully proved his manhood and his worth as a warrior. He earned the right to sit among the men and tell his tale. There were unwritten rules, a code of conduct that distinguished the Creech from murder or indiscriminate pillaging. The target was the cattle. Violence was used only when necessary. Killing needlessly was considered poor form and could provoke a much bloodier retaliation. The true test of skill was not just taking the cattle, but getting them home across miles of hostile territory, evading the pursuit parties. Politically, the Creech was a tool. It was a way to test the neighbor's defenses, to settle old scores, or to assert dominance over a disputed territory. A clan that could not protect its own cattle was seen as weak and vulnerable. This also gave rise to an institutionalized form of extortion known as blackmail, from the Gaelic blackmail, or black tribute. Weaker clans would pay tribute to more powerful ones in exchange for protection from cattle raiders, often from the very recipients of the payment. Most crucially, the Creech was the perpetual training ground for war. It kept the clansmen in a constant state of readiness. It taught them the essential skills of the Highlander warrior, moving quickly and stealthily over difficult terrain, night navigation, ambush tactics, and the importance of teamwork. A man who had survived several Creeches was a veteran soldier. When the chief sent out the fiery cross for a larger conflict, the men who answered were not farmers taking up arms for the first time. They were seasoned warriors whose skills had been honed by a lifetime of small-scale conflict. It was this warrior culture that made the Highland armies so formidable. While the clans lived out their cycle of seasons and local disputes, a political storm was gathering in the south, a storm that would forever change the destiny of the Highlands. The year is 1688. The king ruling England, Scotland, and Ireland is James II of England and VII of Scotland. James is a Stuart, the Scottish dynasty that had united the crowns a century earlier. But James has two flaws that are unforgivable in the eyes of the Protestant elite who dominate the English Parliament. He is openly Catholic, and he firmly believes in the divine right of kings, the doctrine that his authority comes directly from God, not from the people or Parliament. For years, the elite tolerated James, as his heirs were his Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. But, in June 1688, James's second Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gives birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart. Suddenly, the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty in Britain becomes terrifyingly real for the Protestant aristocracy. The fear of popery, associated with the absolutist tyranny of monarchs like Louis XIV of France, grips the nation. For them, a Catholic king meant the end of their religious and parliamentary freedoms. The response of the English elite is swift and decisive. In secret, a group of influential nobles sends an invitation to William of Orange, the ruler of the Netherlands and the husband of James's eldest daughter, Mary. They invite him to invade England with an army to protect the Protestant religion and English liberties. In November 1688, William lands in England with a formidable force. What follows is not a war, but a collapse of support for King James. His army deserts him, his advisors abandon him, and even his other daughter, Anne, turns against him. Amidst the chaos and fearing for his life, James flees to France, an act the English Parliament conveniently interprets as an abdication. The throne is declared vacant and offered to William and Mary. The event, carried out with almost no bloodshed in England, was christened the Glorious Revolution. For the English, it was the final assertion of Parliament's supremacy over the monarch. But, in the midst of the North, in the Scottish Highlands, this event was not seen as glorious. It was seen as a coup d'état, an illegal usurpation. For many clans, loyalty did not belong to a parliament in London, but to the bloodline of the Stuarts, their rightful Scottish kings. Religion also played a complex role. While most of the lowlands was fervently Presbyterian, many Highland clans were Catholic or belonged to the Scottish Episcopal Church, which was more sympathetic to the hierarchical structure favored by the Stuarts. For them, James's deposition was not a liberation. It was an attack on the legitimate and divine order of the world. Thus, while England celebrated its revolution, a counter-revolutionary cause was born in the mountains of Scotland. A cause that would take its name from the Latin for James, Jacobus. They would be the Jacobites. The seed of rebellion was not just planted, it was set in fertile soil, watered by a deep sense of loyalty, honor, and resentment. The deposition of a king in London was the catalyst, but the birth of Jacobitism as an enduring and passionate force in the Highlands was a much deeper process, a confluence of ideology, emotion, religion, and clan politics. It wasn't just a matter of who wore the crown, it was about the very soul of Scotland and the identity of the Highlander people. At the heart of the Jacobite cause was the principle of hereditary legitimacy. For Jacobites, kingship was not an office to be filled by the most popular or politically convenient candidate. It was a sacred right handed down by God through the bloodline. The Stuarts were descendants of Robert the Bruce, heirs to a line of Scottish kings stretching back for centuries. To depose them in favor of a Dutch prince, and later a German elector from the House of Hanover, was a violation of natural and divine law. This belief was particularly strong in a society like the clans, where genealogy and descent defined a man's status, land, and very identity. This dynastic loyalty was intrinsically linked to a growing sense of Scottish nationalism. Although the Stuarts had become kings of England in 1603, they were still seen as a Scottish dynasty. Their fall and the subsequent political domination from London were perceived by many as a national humiliation. The Jacobite cause, therefore, became a vehicle for resistance against increasing Anglicization and the interference of the central government in Scottish life. Supporting the king over the water, as the exiled monarch in France was poetically called, was a way of asserting Scotland's distinct identity. Religion was another fundamental, though complex, pillar. Jacobitism is often portrayed as a purely Catholic movement, but the reality was more nuanced. Indeed, Scotland's Catholic minority, concentrated in parts of the Highlands, was a bedrock of support for the Stuarts. But the most significant religious group within Scottish Jacobitism was the Episcopalians. The Scottish Episcopal Church, with its structure of bishops, had been favored by the Stuart monarchs, but was marginalized after the Glorious Revolution in favor of the Presbyterian Church, which dominated the lowlands. For Episcopalians, the Jacobite cause was a fight for their own religious survival. Finally, clan politics, with its secular rivalries and alliances, played a crucial role. Adherence to the Jacobite, or Hanoverian government side, often had as much to do with who your enemies were as who your friends were. The clearest example of this is Clan Campbell. Led by the powerful Duke of Argyll, the Campbells were the most significant pro-government Presbyterian force in the Highlands. Consequently, many clans that were historic enemies of the Campbells, such as the MacDonalds, still haunted by the memory of the massacre of Glencoe, the Camerons, and the Macleans, found a natural cause in Jacobitism. To fight for the Stuarts was also an opportunity to fight against the Campbells and reverse the expansion of their power. Thus, Highland Gopatism was born of this potent mixture: feudal loyalty to a rightful king, wounded national pride, religious conviction, and bitter clan rivalries. It was a cause that appealed to honor, faith, and the desire for revenge. The Great Rebellion of 1745, led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, lives in the popular imagination as the Jacobite Rising. But it was, in fact, the last of a series of uprisings that erupted periodically for over 50 years. These earlier revolts, though ultimately unsuccessful, were crucial. They served as a baptism of fire for the cause, established the Highlanders' reputation as fearsome warriors, and created a mythology of heroism and sacrifice that would inspire future generations. The first, and perhaps most dramatic of these early insurrections, occurred just 1 year after the Glorious Revolution, in 1689. The man who led it was John Graham of Claverhouse, Viscount Dundee, known to his supporters as Bonnie Dundee. Loyal to James VII to the end, Dundee fled to the Highlands to rally the clans who refused to accept William of Orange as their new king. He was a charismatic leader and a competent military strategist, and he quickly won the support of powerful clans. The new government's response was to send an army under General Hugh Mackay. The decisive confrontation took place on July 27, 1689, at the pass of Killicranchie. Mackay marched his army into the narrow gorge, a vulnerable position. Dundee and his Highlanders took the high ground. In the late afternoon, with the setting sun in the eyes of the government soldiers, Dundee gave the order to attack. What followed was the first large-scale demonstration of the Highland Charge. Dundee's men first fired a single volley from their muskets at short range. Then, casting aside the firearms, they drew their broadswords and, with a terrifying shout, ran downhill. The impact was devastating. Mackay's soldiers, still trying to reload, had no time to react. The wild charge broke their lines in minutes. The battle turned into a rout. Killicranchie was a stunning Jacobite victory and shocked the new regime. It proved that a clan army, properly led, could annihilate a professional military force. However, the victory came at a catastrophic cost. At the moment of his triumph, Bonnie Dundee was mortally wounded. With his death, the Rising lost its most capable leader. Without his strategic vision, the Jacobite army fragmented and was defeated a few months later. Other attempted risings followed. There was an aborted French invasion attempt in 1708. In 1715, a much larger rebellion, the 15, broke out, but it was plagued by indecisive leadership and ended in a stalemate at the Battle of Sheriffmuir. In 1719, a small force of Spaniards and Highlanders was defeated at the Battle of Glenshiel. Each of these failures seemed to weaken the cause, but they also kept it alive. For the government in London, these revolts were a chronic threat. For the Jacobites, they were lessons. They proved that the courage of the Highlanders alone was not enough. They needed a leader who could unite them and a clear strategy, lessons the next Stuart pretender would take to heart. In the early 18th century, while the Jacobite cause simmered beneath the surface, a monumental political event permanently altered the relationship between Scotland and England, adding powerful nationalist fuel to the fire of rebellion. This event was the Act of Union of 1707. Which dissolved the Scottish and English parliaments and merged them into a single parliament of Great Britain, based in Westminster, London. On the surface, the union was presented as a logical partnership. In reality, it was an act born of fear, economic crisis, and political manipulation. On the English side, the primary motivation was security. England was embroiled in the War of the Spanish Succession against France, and France was the main sponsor of the exiled Stuart pretenders. London's nightmare was that Scotland might restore the Stuarts, ally with France, and create a hostile battlefront on its northern border. Union was the way to neutralize this threat. On the Scottish side, the motivation was largely economic desperation. In the late 17th century, Scotland invested a fortune in the Darien scheme, an attempt to establish a trading colony in Panama. The project was a catastrophic disaster, ruined by disease, mismanagement, and political sabotage from England. The Scottish nation was left on the verge of bankruptcy, and its noble elite faced financial ruin. The English saw their opportunity. During the negotiations, they offered a substantial payment, known as the equivalent, ostensibly to compensate Scotland, but which in practice was used to bail out the Darien investors and, according to many, to bribe Scottish parliamentarians to vote in favor of the Union. Opposition to the Union throughout Scotland was massive and passionate. There were riots in the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow. The popular sentiment was perhaps best captured by Scotland's great national poet, Robert Burns, who later wrote, "We're bought and sold for English gold." For the common Scot, and especially for the Highlanders, the Union was not a partnership. It was a surrender. It was the selling of Scotland's sovereignty and independence by a corrupt aristocracy. In the Highlands, where distrust of the central government already ran deep, the act of union was seen as the final insult. It solidified the perception that London did not have Scotland's best interests at heart, and that the only hope for restoring national honor lay in restoring the Stuart monarchy. The Jacobite cause, already strong for dynastic and religious reasons, now merged with a powerful sense of wounded patriotism. To fight for King James was to fight to tear up a hated treaty. It's incredible to think how decisions made in distant parliamentary halls could seal the fate of so many people in the remote glens of Scotland. This chain of events is what makes history so powerful. If you are fascinated by uncovering these connections, consider subscribing to our channel. Every like and share helps to spread this knowledge. We would love to know where you are watching from. Tell us in the comments. And if there is another historical saga you would like us to explore, leave your suggestion. In the world of the Highlander, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was thin and permeable, like the mist that clung to the mountainsides. Christianity coexisted with a much older substrate of beliefs, a world populated by fairies, water spirits, and omens. Central to this worldview was the belief in the second sight, or in daishilad in Gaelic. It was not considered witchcraft or an evil art, but rather a gift, or, more often, a curse. The ability to see glimpses of the future, often cryptically and almost always tragically. Individuals with the second sight, known as seers, were respected and feared figures, their enigmatic words pondered and remembered for generations. No seer is more famous in Scottish folklore than Coinach, the Brahman seer, although his existence as a single historical figure is impossible to verify. The prophecies attributed to him became an integral part of the Highlands' mythical tapestry. Legend holds that Coinach, a 17th century worker for the clan Mackenzie, received his gift from a spirit after falling asleep on a fairy hill. He awoke to find a small stone with a hole in the middle. Looking through it, he could see the future. His prophecies, passed down orally for generations before being compiled in the 19th century, were notable for their specificity and, often, their melancholy. It is crucial to note, as historians do, that the lack of contemporary written records makes it impossible to prove that these prophecies were made before the events they describe. They may well be examples of post-event prophecy, created to give a sense of inevitable destiny to the tragedies that befell the people. Nevertheless, their persistence in oral tradition reveals much about the Highlander mindset and its need to find a pattern and meaning in the chaos of history. Several of his darkest prophecies seem to directly foretell the destruction of the clan way of life. He allegedly predicted that the day will come when the black hoof of the sheep will banish the people from the glens. A chillingly accurate vision of the future Highland clearances, where landowners would evict their tenants to make way for more profitable Shivia sheep. Another ominous prophecy spoke of a black, unlucky head of the clan who would lead his people to ruin. To many, this seemed to point to the leaders of the 1745 rebellion. His most famous and chilling prediction, however, is directly tied to the battle that would seal the Jacobites' fate. It is said that Brahman seer foretold that when a fox gives birth to its cubs on the highest turret of Brahman Castle, and when a white crow is seen on the nearby cliffs, the Mackenzies will lose their lands, and the field of Drummassy Moor will be stained with the best blood of the Highlands. Drummassy Moor is the other name for Culloden Moor. For a people who lived in a world where omens were read in the flight of birds and the future whispered on the wind, such prophecies were not mere stories. They created a deep sense of fatalism. The belief that their fate was already written, that their fall was inevitable, may have added a layer of despair and nihilistic courage to their actions. If defeat was already prophesied, then one might as well fight with the fury of men who had nothing to lose. True or not, the prophecies of the Brehon seer and others like him became part of the narrative of the Highlander tragedy, transforming the story of a political and military defeat into an epic saga of unavoidable destiny, as dark and grand as the landscapes they inhabited. In the gilded exile of Rome and Paris, the young Charles Edward Stuart was raised for a single purpose: to reclaim the three thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland. His grandfather, James II, had lost. He was nurtured with stories of the unwavering loyalty of the Highland clans, depicted as mythic warriors waiting only for the call of their true prince. In 1745, at the age of 24, Charles decided the wait was over. Impatient with the empty promises and hesitant diplomacy of France, he made a decision of monumental audacity, or of arrogant folly. Pawning his mother's jewels, he managed to charter two ships, the Du Tillet and the Elizabeth, and set sail for Scotland. He brought no French army, no royal treasury, not even the formal approval of King Louis XV. He brought with him only a handful of companions, known as the Seven Men of Moidart, and an unshakable faith in his own destiny. On July 23, 1745, the Du Tillet, the Elizabeth, carrying arms and volunteers, had been damaged in a battle with a British ship and forced to return anchored off the island of Arrasquay in the Outer Hebrides. The prince's landing on Scottish soil was not a triumphal arrival, but a quiet, tense event. The first reaction of the local chiefs was shock and dismay. Alexander MacDonald of Boisdale, upon learning the prince had arrived without French troops, refused to commit and bluntly advised him, "Go home." Charles's reply, whether apocryphal or real, captured the essence of his stubborn, romantic character. "I am come home, sir, and I will not be dissuaded." From Arrasquay, he sailed to the mainland, landing at Loch Nan. The news of his arrival spread like wildfire through the heather, causing panic in the government and an agonizing dilemma for the Jacobite clan chiefs. They had pledged loyalty, but on the condition of substantial French military support. The arrival of a prince with empty hands seemed like an invitation to suicide. The most crucial encounter occurred with Donald Cameron of Laheel, chief of the powerful clan Cameron, known as the Gentle Laheel. A pragmatic and cautious man went to meet the prince with the firm intention of persuading him to return to France. He argued logically, pointing out the lack of men, arms, and money, and the overwhelming power of the British state. The rebellion, he said, was doomed to fail and would bring utter ruin to the Highlands. Charles listened, and instead of counter-arguing with strategy, he appealed to honor, emotion, and shame. Accounts of the conversation claim that, seeing Laheel was adamant, the prince played his final card. He declared that if even his most loyal friends abandoned him, he would prefer to raise the standard alone, and that Laheel, the great Cameron, could stay at home and read about his prince's fate in the newspapers. It was a masterstroke of emotional manipulation, aimed directly at the heart of the Highlander code of honor. The thought of abandoning his prince to fight alone, the shame it would bring upon his clan's name for generations, was more than Laheel could bear. With what he later described as a heavy heart, he relented. "No," he reportedly said, "I will share the fate of my prince, and so shall every man over whom nature or fortune hath given me any power." With the Cameron support secured, other hesitant clans, like the MacDonalds of Keppoch and the MacDonalds of Glengarry, followed suit. The desperate gamble of Charles Edward Stuart had paid off. The engine of rebellion, which had seemed destined to stall before it even started, now began to turn, driven not by logic, but by an ancient and fatal code of loyalty. August 19, 1745, was destined to become one of the most iconic and melancholic dates in Scottish history. The chosen location was Glenfinnan, a spectacularly beautiful and remote glen at the head of Loch Shiel. It was a place of strategic and symbolic significance, deep in the heart of loyal clan territory. On the morning of that day, Prince Charles and his small group of followers arrived at the appointed spot and waited, and waited. For hours, the glen remained strangely silent and empty. Only the echo of the wind and the call of birds broke the stillness. For the young prince, that silence must have been deafening. Every minute, an agony of doubt. Had his gamble failed? Had the chief's reluctance turned into refusal? Would the great rebellion die here in an empty glen before it was even declared? The anxiety was palpable. The prince, dressed not in the kilt he would later adopt, but in the attire of an Irish gentleman, paced back and forth. But then, in the distance, a faint sound was heard. A sound that grew until it became the most welcome music he could imagine, the unmistakable sound of the bagpipes. Looking south, they saw a sight that would make any exiled Stuart's heart soar. Descending the hills in ordered columns, their tartans vibrant against the green landscape, came the men of Clan Cameron, led by the gentle Lahil. Some 700 to 800 warriors, their broadswords glinting in the sun. Shortly after, from another direction, came the MacDonalds of Keepock and other smaller groups. The glen, once empty, was now alive with the movement and sound of hundreds of Highlanders gathering for the cause. The prince's relief must have been immense, his faith in the loyalty of the clans rewarded. The central moment of the day arrived. The Marquis of Tullibardine, an elderly Jacobite noble who had been exiled for his part in the 1715 Rising, and who now claimed the title of Duke of Athol, was given the honor. With hands trembling from age and emotion, he unfurled the royal standard. It was a large banner of red silk with a white square in the center. As he raised it, the wind caught it and unfurled it against the blue sky. A roar of acclamation rose from the assembled clans. Bonnets were thrown into the air. Swords were drawn and raised in salute. The bagpipes struck up a war tune, their sound echoing through the mountains that had witnessed centuries of clan history. In that instant, the rebellion became real. A commission of regency from Charles's father, King James VIII, was read aloud, declaring the intention to dissolve the pretended union and restore the throne to its rightful line. It was a moment of pure political theater, imbued with an almost mythical romanticism. For the men gathered there, it was the culmination of generations of loyalty and resentment. It was the chance to right the wrongs of the past, to restore Scotland's honor, and to fight for their rightful king. Yet, beneath the surface of celebration, an undercurrent of apprehension lingered. Many of the older men, veterans of the failed risings of 1715 and 1719, knew how long and unlikely the road ahead was. They looked at the young prince, full of confidence and charisma, and wondered if his courage would be matched by wisdom and luck. The standard at Glenfinnan was a symbol of hope and defiance, but it was also a point of no return. By gathering under that silk banner, the clans had declared war on the most powerful empire of the age. The fate of the Highlands, for better or worse, was now irrevocably tied to the fate of that young prince and his last desperate bid for the throne. With the standard raised and a clan army that grew by the day, the Jacobite rebellion left the safety of the Highlands and began to move with a speed and audacity that caught the government completely by surprise. The commander of government forces in Scotland, Sir John Cope, was a competent but conventional general, wholly unprepared for the irregular warfare and fast pace of his Highlander opponents. In an initial maneuver that bordered on a comedy of errors, Cope marched his army north into the mountains to intercept the Jacobites, only to find they had used cattle drovers' paths to bypass him and now had a clear road to the lowlands. While Cope was forced into a long march north to Inverness to then embark his men and sail back south, Prince Charles's army marched virtually unopposed toward the heart of Scotland. Their speed was astonishing. The Highlander army, unburdened by a long supply train or heavy artillery, could cover distances over difficult terrain that regular armies would deem impossible. On September 4th, they took the city of Perth, where they were joined by more recruits and where Charles's father was formally proclaimed King James VIII. From there, they marched south toward the capital, Edinburgh. The city, with its ancient defenses in disrepair and a weak government garrison, was seized by panic. On September 17th, a party of Camerons under Lahil used a stratagem to enter the city, rushing a gate as a coach was passing through. Edinburgh, with the exception of its staunchly held castle, fell to the Jacobites without a single shot being fired. For Charles, it was the moment of his greatest triumph yet. He set up his court in the historic palace of Holyrood House, the ancient residence of his Stuart ancestors, and for a brief period, he lived like a king. Meanwhile, Sir John Cope had finally landed his army at Dunbar, east of Edinburgh, and marched to retake the capital. Charles, advised by the brilliant but temperamental strategist Lord George Murray, decided not to wait for a siege. Instead, he led his army out of the city to meet Cope in open battle. The two armies met near the village of Prestonpans on September 21, 1745. Cope's army was larger, well equipped with artillery and cavalry, and comprised of regular soldiers. The Jacobite army was almost entirely infantry, armed mainly with swords and shields. Cope drew up his men in a strong position, with a marsh protecting his flank. The battle seemed decided in his favor. However, during the night, a local sympathizer showed Lord George Murray a secret path through the marsh. In the cold morning mist, the Highlander army executed a brilliant flanking march, bypassing the marsh and emerging on the unprotected wing of Cope's army. The government soldiers, taken by surprise, barely had time to turn their front line to face the threat. It was then that the Jacobites attacked. With the morning sun breaking through the mist and the clan war cry piercing the air, the Highland charge was unleashed. The effect was even more devastating than at Killiecrankie. The sight and sound of the wild men rushing toward them, with their broadswords and their screams, caused total panic among the regular soldiers, many of whom were inexperienced recruits. The government line disintegrated. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes. It was an annihilation. Hundreds of government soldiers were killed or wounded, and most of the rest were taken prisoner. Cope's army simply ceased to exist. The news of the humiliating defeat at Prestonpans sent a seismic shock through London. The rebellion, once dismissed as a minor, local trouble, was now seen as a deadly threat to the Hanoverian dynasty. The young prince's march of victory had turned a romantic adventure into a national crisis. In the aftermath of the stunning victory at Prestonpans, the Jacobite army seemed invincible, and Prince Charles's court at Holyrood House Palace was a whirlwind of optimism and celebration. However, behind the facade of unity and triumph, the fissures that would ultimately doom the cause began to appear. The Jacobite command was not a unified military structure, but an unstable coalition of diverse interests, strong personalities, and ancient rivalries. The tensions that arose were not just about strategy, but about power, pride, and the very nature of the rebellion. At the center of the conflict were two dominant figures, Prince Charles himself and his Lieutenant General, Lord George Murray. Charles Edward Stuart was the heart and soul of the cause. His charisma was undeniable, and his determination to march south and take London was absolute. He was the prince by divine right, and he believed his presence would inspire a mass uprising of English Jacobites. However, he was young, impetuous, and had no real military experience. He tended to favor an inner circle of advisors, many of whom were Irish and French exiles like John O'Sullivan, who was a competent organizer but who did not understand the mindset of the clan chiefs. Charles was, in essence, an absolutist who expected his orders to be obeyed without question, a wholly unrealistic expectation in a volunteer army of Highlanders. Lord George Murray was the military brain of the rebellion, the brother of the pro-government Duke of Atholl. Murray was a veteran of the 1715 and 1719 risings, a brilliant strategist, and a man of immense personal courage. He understood Highland warfare and the clan mentality better than anyone. It was his tactical genius that had secured the victory at Prestonpans. However, Murray was also proud, abrasive, and notoriously difficult to deal with. He deeply distrusted the prince's Irish advisors and did not hesitate to voice his contempt for their opinions, which he considered those of dangerous amateurs. He saw the rebellion not as a romantic crusade, but as a military campaign that required pragmatism and caution. This fundamental difference in temperament and outlook created a paralyzing, mutual distrust between the prince and his best general. Charles resented Murray's overbearing and often pessimistic nature, while Murray was exasperated by the prince's unrealistic optimism and his refusal to listen to sound military advice. Beyond this central conflict, the old clan rivalries simmered beneath the surface. The MacDonalds and the Camerons, for instance, vied for the position of honor on the right wing of the battle line, a matter of immense prestige. The chiefs, who were kings in their own territories, did not see themselves as mere colonels in a regular army. They were allies of the prince, not his subjects, and they expected to be consulted on all major decisions. The creation of a council of war, composed of the chiefs and nobles, was a political necessity. but it also created an environment for endless and paralyzing debates. There was also a fundamental strategic divide. The clan chiefs, for the most part, wanted to consolidate their power in Scotland, perhaps even convene a Scottish parliament. Their aim was primarily Scottish. Charles, on the other hand, saw Scotland merely as a stepping stone. His goal was London and the throne of Great Britain. These conflicting visions of the war's ultimate objective would be the crux of the most crucial decision the Jacobite army would have to make. For now, the momentum of victory held them together. But the seeds of discord had been planted, and under the pressure of the coming campaign, they would begin to sprout. After 6 weeks in Edinburgh, consolidating their forces and trying without much success to raise more recruits from the lowlands, the Jacobite War Council faced its most fateful decision: what to do next. Most of the Scottish chiefs, including the cautious Lord George Murray, argued for remaining in Scotland. They contended that they should consolidate their control, defeat the remaining government forces in the north, and wait for a promised French landing. The idea of invading England, a much larger country with vastly superior resources, with an army of only 5,000 infantry and a few hundred horsemen, seemed to them to be strategic madness. But Prince Charles was adamant. His goal had always been London. He painted an optimistic picture of thousands of English Jacobites rising to join his cause as soon as he crossed the border. With a mixture of promises, pleas, and a veiled threat to abandon the cause, he finally won the council over. Reluctantly, and with many dark forebodings, the chiefs agreed to march south. In early November 1745, the Jacobite army crossed into England. To deceive the government forces, Lord George Murray executed a brilliant feint, splitting the army into 2 columns and making Marshal George Wade, who was at Newcastle with a sizable force, believe they were heading east. Instead, the army reunited and marched swiftly west, besieging and capturing the fortress city of Carlisle in just a few days. The fall of Carlisle, the first English city to fall, sent a new wave of panic throughout the country. From there, the Jacobite army plunged into the heart of England, moving with its characteristic speed. They passed through Penrith, Kendal, and Lancaster, reaching Manchester. Here, they had their only significant recruiting success in England, forming the Manchester Regiment from about 300 volunteers. It was a disappointing number, far from the thousands the prince had promised, but the march continued. The government in London was in complete chaos. King George II made plans to flee back to his native electorate of Hanover in Germany. The wealth of the city of London was moved to the Tower of London for safekeeping. Wild rumors circulated that the Highlanders were savage cannibals who ate children. 2 large government forces were mobilized to stop them: Wade's army, now marching south from the north, and a new army under the command of the Duke of Cumberland, the king's son, which was assembling in the Midlands. The Jacobite army, through swift maneuvering and clever intelligence, managed to evade both forces. On December 4, 1745, the Highlander army marched into the town of Derby. They were just 125 miles from London. This was the high water mark of the rebellion, the moment when a Stuart restoration seemed genuinely possible. In London, the day became known as Black Friday. Financial panic gripped the city, and there was a run on the banks. A makeshift defense force was assembled at Finchley Common to protect the capital. The Jacobite army at Derby was the most effective fighting force in England at that moment. Had they pushed on, what might have happened is one of the great what-ifs of British history. They were at the height of their audacity, having marched hundreds of miles into enemy territory, outnumbered and outmaneuvering every general sent against them. Yet it was here, in Derby, at the moment of their closest approach to victory, that the rebellion's momentum would be fatally broken, not by an enemy bullet, but by a crisis of confidence and a bitter decision made in a council room. The arrival of the Jacobite army at Derby represented the military apex of the rebellion, but it also precipitated its final crisis of leadership. While Prince Charles, euphoric and more confident than ever, was determined to press on for the final march on London, his commanders, led by Lord George Murray, viewed the situation with grim realism. On the evening of December 5, 1745, at Exeter House in Derby, the Jacobite War Council convened for its most important and contentious meeting. Murray and the other clan chiefs presented the prince with a bleak picture of their strategic situation. Despite their spectacular march, the prince's promises had failed to materialize. The hope for English Jacobite rising was a mirage. Only the small Manchester regiment had joined them. There was no sign of a French landing on the south coast to divide the enemy forces. They were now deep in hostile territory with an army that had dwindled to fewer than 5,000 men. Ahead of them in London was the Finchley defense force of uncertain size, but more dangerously, they were now caught in a pincer. Marshal Wade's army of some 7,000 men was closing in from behind, coming from Yorkshire, and the Duke of Cumberland's army of nearly 10,000 was regrouping very close by at Lichfield. They were in a trap. To advance meant risking total annihilation between two superior armies with no route of escape. To Murray and the chiefs, the choice was clear and logical. The only militarily sane option was to retreat to the safety of Scotland, where they could regroup with new recruits and supplies that had gathered in their absence. Prince Charles was horrified and furious. He saw retreat as an act of cowardice, a betrayal at the moment of imminent victory. He believed the news of his approach would cause the Hanoverian regime in London to collapse. He pleaded, argued, and threatened. He accused his commanders of betraying him. The debate was heated and bitter. The prince, feeling his dreams slipping away, reportedly declared he would rather be buried 20 feet under the earth than turn back. But this time the council was united against him. The clan chiefs, who had risked everything for his cause, refused to lead their men to certain annihilation. They were not a regular army bound to obey suicidal orders. They were leaders of their own people, and their first responsibility was to them. After hours of debate, the decision was made by the overwhelming majority of the council. They would retreat. The retreat from Derby was a devastating and irrecoverable blow to the morale of the Jacobite army and the authority of the prince. Charles was heartbroken, his relationship with Lord George Murray permanently poised. He reportedly refused to speak to his commanders, riding bitterly at the rear of the army. To the common soldiers, the decision was incomprehensible. They had overcome every obstacle, won every battle, and marched to the gates of the enemy capital. Now, without even seeing the enemy, they were turning back. The spirit of invincibility that had carried them to Derby evaporated. The retreat itself was a tactical masterpiece, masterfully conducted by Murray, who fought off an attempted attack by Cumberland's cavalry in a rearguard action at Clifton Moor, the last battle on English soil. But while militarily successful, the retreat was a strategic and psychological disaster. The rebellion's momentum was lost forever. They were no longer the hunters, but the hunted. The long, grim road back to Scotland would lead, inevitably, to the bog of Culloden. As the Jacobite army bitterly retreated from Derby, the British state's response to the rebellion was solidifying around a new central figure, a man whose very presence signaled that the phase of containment was over and the phase of annihilation was about to begin. This man was Prince William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, the second son of King George II. At 24 years old, the same age as his adversary, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Cumberland was, in many respects, his polar opposite. Where Charles was charismatic, romantic, and dependent on voluntary loyalty, Cumberland was brusque, obese, uncharismatic, and a ruthless military disciplinarian who commanded through fear and a rigid adherence to duty. He did not see the Jacobites as legitimate opponents in a dynastic dispute, but as traitors and barbaric rebels who needed to be crushed without mercy. Cumberland already had a considerable military reputation, forged on the battlefields of the War of the Austrian Succession. In May 1745, at the Battle of Fontenoy, he had commanded the Allied army against the French, though it was a defeat for the British. Cumberland was praised for his personal bravery, was wounded in the leg and for maintaining the discipline of his troops under heavy fire. He was a meticulous organizer, a believer in the superiority of firepower and discipline over what he saw as the undisciplined, savage fervor of the Highlanders. His appointment as Supreme Commander of British forces in Britain was a clear sign of the seriousness with which the government now viewed the threat. The previous generals like Cope and Wade had been outmaneuvered and humiliated. Cumberland was sent to do the dirty work, and he would do it with a methodical cruelty that would earn him the lasting moniker the Butcher. His approach was entirely different from his predecessors. He would not be rushed or tricked. After the Jacobite retreat from Derby, he pursued the retreating army, but cautiously, using his cavalry to harry the rear guard, as at the skirmish at Clifton Moor. Upon reaching Carlisle, he did not simply recapture the city. He made an example of the Manchester regiment that had been left behind as a garrison. After their surrender, he reneged on the terms, and many were later brutally executed for treason. It was a preview of his scorched earth policy. Upon arriving in Scotland in early 1746, he did not rush into battle. He established his headquarters in Aberdeen and spent weeks training and refitting his army, which had been shaken by the earlier defeats. Most important was the specific training he instituted to counter the Highland charge. Previous generals had no answer for it. Cumberland developed a new and brutally effective bayonet drill. Instead of each soldier trying to stop the Highlander directly in front of him, a difficult attack to parry due to the Highlander's targe shield, Cumberland trained his men to strike differently. Each soldier in the front rank was instructed to ignore the man rushing at him, and instead thrust his bayonet into the exposed right flank of the Highlander, attacking his comrade to his left. This would create a wall of bayonets that would pierce the attackers from their unprotected sides. He drilled his troops relentlessly in this new tactic, using stakes to simulate the charge. He was turning his army into a killing machine perfectly adapted to destroy its opponents. Cumberland was not just preparing to win a battle. He was preparing to exterminate an army and the warrior culture that sustained it. The clash between the romanticism of Charles and the brutal pragmatism of Cumberland was approaching, and the outcome would be terribly one-sided. The retreat from Derby saved the Jacobite army from tactical annihilation in England, but it plunged them into a slow, agonizing war of attrition during the harsh winter of 1745–46. Upon returning to Scotland, the army split. Prince Charles and part of the force marched to Glasgow, where they extorted supplies from a notoriously hostile city, while Lord George Murray took the rest north. They reunited in January near Stirling, where they received reinforcements from northern clans and some French support that had finally arrived, including weapons and a few military advisors. With their numbers now at their peak of about 9,000 men, they laid siege to Stirling Castle and prepared to face a new government army under General Henry Hawley. On January 17, 1746, at the Battle of Falkirk Muir, the Jacobites managed one last surprising victory. In wet and windy conditions, they again used a flanking charge to rout Hawley's army, which, like Cope before him, had grossly underestimated its opponents. However, the victory at Falkirk was confused and incomplete. Poor coordination and the foul weather allowed much of the government army to escape, and the Jacobites failed to exploit their success. The victory provided a temporary morale boost, but failed to reverse the strategic deterioration of their situation. The siege of Stirling Castle continued to flounder, and the news of the Duke of Cumberland's arrival in Scotland to take personal command cast a pall over the army. Faced with Cumberland's methodical advance, the Jacobite command made the decision to abandon the siege of Stirling and retreat north into the Highlands. This was another bitter decision that enraged Prince Charles, but it was dictated by grim reality. The army was disintegrating. The clansmen, following their tradition, often went home after a battle to ensure the safety of their families and lands. Desertion was a chronic problem. More importantly, logistics were collapsing. Keeping an army of thousands fed and paid in the Highlands, a region of subsistence agriculture, during the winter was an almost impossible task. The French money that had arrived was insufficient and poorly managed. Promises of pay went unfulfilled, and the men began to starve. The retreat to Inverness and the surrounding areas in the late winter became a desperate struggle for survival. The army was dispersed over a wide area to make foraging for food easier. The men were forced to live off the land, often forcibly requisitioning what little the local population had. The romantic image of the liberating army began to tarnish, replaced by the hard reality of hungry soldiers. The weather was abysmal, with snow and ice making roads impassable and life miserable. Discipline, always loose in a clan army, began to break down. Meanwhile, in Aberdeen, Cumberland was refitting and drilling his army, ensuring his men were well-fed, well-paid, and well-equipped. Had the logistical might of the British state behind him, with Royal Navy ships sailing up the coast to supply him. The war had become a contest of logistics, and it was a contest the Jacobites could not win. By the early spring of 1746, the Jacobite army was weakened, hungry, scattered, and in tatters. The war machine Cumberland had built was about to move in for the final blow, against an opponent that was already on its knees. The winter of starvation had done as effective a job as any army in sealing the rebellion's fate. In early April 1746, the inevitable confrontation loomed. The Duke of Cumberland, having meticulously prepared his army, began his march west from Aberdeen toward the Jacobite headquarters at Inverness. His army of about 9,000 men was a cohesive and confident force. In contrast, the Jacobite army that gathered to meet him was a shadow of its former self. They barely numbered 5,000, and many of them were in poor physical condition from months of malnutrition. Entire clans, like the Macphersons and a large portion of the Frasers, had not yet arrived, being either on the march or away on other duties. The money had run out, and food was so scarce that many soldiers' ration on the day before the battle consisted of a single biscuit. On April 15th, Cumberland's army made camp at Balblair, near Nairn, about 12 miles east of the Jacobite position at Culloden. It was Cumberland's 25th birthday, and his men were issued an extra ration of brandy and cheese to celebrate. The government camp was a place of celebration and confidence. In the Jacobite camp, the atmosphere was one of growing desperation. Aware of their inferiority in numbers and condition, the Jacobite command knew that a pitched battle on open ground would be suicide. It was then that Lord George Murray proposed a daring plan, born of necessity, a surprise night attack on Cumberland's camp. The idea was to march through the night and fall upon the sleeping, drunken enemy in their tents at dawn, using surprise and terror to neutralize the enemy's superior firepower. It was a risky plan, the only hope they had left. Prince Charles, initially hesitant, eventually agreed. The execution of the plan was a disaster from the start. The Jacobite army was supposed to set off in the early evening to cover the 12 miles of difficult terrain in time. However, the distribution of the meager rations delayed the start for hours. When they finally began to march in 2 columns, the night was pitch black and the ground, a rugged bog, was terribly difficult to traverse. The march became a slow, torturous ordeal. Starving, exhausted men stumbled and fell, getting lost in the darkness. The 2 columns became separated. Cohesion disintegrated. As dawn approached, it became painfully clear they would not reach the enemy camp before sunrise. The element of surprise, the essential component of the plan, was lost. Lord George Murray, commanding the lead column, made the inevitable decision. He ordered the retreat. The march back to Culloden was even worse. It was the march of a defeated army that had not even fought. The men, who had not slept for nearly 2 nights and had barely eaten, were physically and psychologically shattered. They stumbled back to their camp through the morning of April 16th, not to rest, but to the news that Cumberland's army, alert and at full strength, was advancing toward them. Many men, desperate for food or sleep, simply scattered into the nearby fields and cottages. Others collapsed from exhaustion where they stood. There was no time for rest or recovery. The alarm drum sounded, and the officers frantically tried to rally the scattered, exhausted men into a line of battle. They would form this line on the ground their quartermaster John O'Sullivan had chosen, Drumessie Moor, a flat, boggy, open field, perfectly suited for the enemy's artillery and cavalry, and terrible ground for a Highland charge. The disastrous night march had not only failed in its objective, but had served to deliver to the Duke of Cumberland an exhausted, starving, and demoralized army on the worst possible terrain. The eve of Culloden did not set the stage for a battle. It set the stage for a sacrifice. On the cold, wet morning of April 16, 1746, the remnants of the Jacobite army formed up for battle on Drumessie Moor. The wind blew a mixture of sleet and rain into their faces. They were exhausted, hungry, and outnumbered. Before them, less than half a mile away, the Duke of Cumberland's army deployed with terrifying calm and discipline. They were some 8,000 to 9,000 men, well fed and rested, arranged in 3 perfect lines, with their cavalry protecting the flanks and their artillery placed at deadly intervals. The terrain, chosen by the Prince's quartermaster John O'Sullivan, was a death trap. It was a flat, open moor, offering no cover, providing a perfect field of fire for the British cannons and firm ground for the cavalry. It was the worst imaginable place for the Highlander infantry. The battle began not with a war cry, but with an artillery duel, a duel the Jacobites could not win. Their few cannons were of a smaller caliber, poorly served, and quickly silenced by the superior government artillery. With their own guns useless, the clans were forced to endure a relentless bombardment for nearly half an hour. Cumberland's cannons, loaded with grapeshot, fired systematically into the packed ranks of the Highlanders. Each blast tore bloody holes in their lines, scything down men who could only stand and watch, helpless. Morale began to crumble under the carnage. The clans in the front line, especially those in the center and on the right, screamed for permission to charge. To stand still under artillery fire was torture for men accustomed to swift, ferocious combat. It was, as one survivor put it, like being in hell. Finally, the order to charge was given. But instead of a unified, overwhelming advance, the Highland charge at Culloden was a disjointed tragedy. The clans on the right wing, led by the Athelmen and the Camerons, moved first, running desperately through the artillery and musket fire. The ground in their path was particularly boggy, which slowed the charge and broke their cohesion. Even so, with suicidal courage, a contingent of them managed to reach the British lines. They crashed into Borellis and Monroe's regiments. And for a terrifying moment, the hand-to-hand fighting that ensued was savage. The Highlanders' broadswords slashed and stabbed, and the government line buckled. But it was then that Cumberland's training proved its worth. The second line of British troops moved up to plug the gap, and the soldiers executed the new bayonet drill with lethal precision, stabbing the Highlanders from their unprotected flanks. The charge, which had come so close to breaking the line, was stopped and thrown back, the attackers impaled on a wall of steel. Meanwhile, on the Jacobite left wing, the situation was even worse. The MacDonald clans, insulted at not being given the position of honor on the right wing, which they claimed by tradition, advanced hesitantly and in disarray. They suffered heavily from enfilading fire from artillery and rifle regiments, and their charge faltered and stopped before it even reached the enemy. With the charge collapsing on both wings, the battle turned into a rout. The government cavalry was then unleashed in pursuit, riding down the fugitives as they fled across the moor. The Battle of Culloden lasted less than an hour. For the Jacobites, it was a total and catastrophic defeat. An estimated 1,500 to 2,000 Jacobites were killed or wounded, compared to only about 300 casualties on the government side. It was not just a battle lost, it was the violent, bloody end of the Stuart cause and of the Highland clan way of life. The brutality of Culloden did not end when the cannons fell silent, or when the Jacobite army fled. What followed the battle was a campaign of calculated, methodical cruelty that would forever tarnish the reputation of the Duke of Cumberland, and earn him the epithet, the Butcher. Immediately after the battle, orders were given, according to many accounts, by Cumberland himself, that no quarter was to be given to the rebels. This meant that the rules of war, which would normally allow for surrender and the treatment of prisoners, were suspended. The pursuit of the fleeing Highlanders was relentless. Government cavalry, especially Cobham's and Kingston's dragoons, scoured the countryside and the roads leading from Culloden, cutting down anyone who looked like a rebel, whether armed or not. On the battlefield itself, a scene of horror unfolded. Patrols of British infantry walked the moor, systematically inspecting the bodies of the fallen Highlanders. They used their bayonets to kill anyone who showed the slightest sign of life. The moans of the wounded were silenced by the point of the steel. Eyewitness accounts from both civilians and appalled government officers describe scenes of cold-blooded carnage. In one infamous incident, some 19 wounded Jacobite officers who had taken refuge in a barn at Old Lennox Farm on the edge of the battlefield were discovered. Sentries were posted at the doors, and the barn was deliberately set on fire, burning the men inside alive. Those who tried to escape were shot or forced back into the flames. The hunt for the wounded continued in the days that followed the battle. The houses and cottages around Inverness were searched. Any wounded man found was dragged outside and summarily executed. The town of Inverness, which had been the Jacobite headquarters, became a vast prison camp and a slaughterhouse. The jails and churches were crammed with prisoners in appalling conditions, where many died of their wounds, disease, or starvation. Executions were a daily spectacle. The treatment of the prisoners was a deliberate violation of all the norms of civilized warfare of the time. Cumberland and his officers justified their actions by arguing that the Jacobites were not soldiers of an enemy army, but traitors in rebellion against their rightful king, and therefore deserved none of the rights of combatants. To them, this was not a war, but an operation to exterminate a pestilence. The ferocity of the immediate repression served a clear purpose: to terrorize the Highland population and crush any remaining flicker of fighting spirit. It was an unequivocal message that not only had the rebellion been defeated, but that the price of treason would be annihilation. The image of Butcher Cumberland was not a later product of Jacobite propaganda. It was born right there, on the blood-soaked field of Culloden, and in the cold-blooded executions that followed. The actions of his army in the days after the battle transformed a decisive military victory into an act of barbarity that would leave a deep and lasting scar on the Scottish psyche, a memory of cruelty that time would not erase. The massacre was the grim prelude to an even broader and more systematic repression to come, a repression that would target not just the men who fought, but their entire culture. If this part of the story has shocked you with its brutality, know that it is just one chapter in a much larger saga. Leave a like if you believe these stories need to be told, so they are never forgotten. While his followers were being slaughtered at Culloden and hunted through the hills, the architect of the rebellion, Charles Edward Stuart, was fleeing for his life. Accompanied by a small group of his closest advisors, he was led from the battlefield and began an epic 5-month journey as a fugitive, a saga that would transform him from a warrior prince into a figure of romantic legend. A massive reward of £30,000, an astronomical fortune at the time, equivalent to millions today, was placed on his head. The British government unleashed one of the greatest manhunts in history, with thousands of soldiers and militia scouring the Highlands and Islands, determined to capture the young pretender. Charles's flight was an odyssey through some of the wildest and most inhospitable terrain in Scotland. He hid in caves, slept in the open on sodden moors, and sheltered in humble cottages, often starving and suffering from dysentery. His appearance changed dramatically. The once impeccably dressed prince became a ragged, bearded figure, plagued by lice and the constant fear of capture. Yet the most remarkable aspect of his escape was not the hardship he endured, but the unshakable loyalty of the people who helped him. In a time of extreme poverty, where £30,000 could have transformed anyone's life, not a single Highlander betrayed him. Risking execution for treason and the burning of their homes, hundreds of common people and clan chiefs conspired to keep him safe. The most famous phase of his escape took place in the Outer Hebrides. Trapped on the islands with the Royal Navy patrolling the waters, his capture seemed inevitable. It was then that a 24-year-old woman, Flora MacDonald, stepped into history. Although her family had divided loyalties and her stepfather commanded a pro-government militia, Flora agreed to help the prince escape from the island of South Uist to the Isle of Skye. The plan was daring and dangerous. Charles was disguised as Betty Burke, an Irish spinning maid, wearing a calico dress and a bonnet. The image of the royal prince in drag has become one of the most enduring tallies of Jacobite folklore. Accompanied by a few boatmen, Flora rowed with the disguised prince across the perilous waters, slipping past government patrol boats. They landed successfully on Skye, and Flora handed him over to other Jacobite sympathizers who helped him continue his journey. The loyalty shown by people like Flora MacDonald and countless others whose names are lost to history was complex. It was a mixture of adherence to the Stuart cause, a deep sense of hospitality and honor. Protecting a guest, even an uninvited one, was a sacred duty, and defiance of the brutal government authority. They did not risk their lives just for a prince, but for a code of ethics that was older and deeper than any law imposed by London. After countless other narrow escapes and periods in hiding, including a time when he sheltered in a cave with a group of loyal outlaws known as the 7 Men of Glenmorston, help finally arrived. On September 20th, 1746, 2 French privateer ships arrived at Loch Nan Uam, the same spot on the mainland where he had landed with such hope the previous year. Charles, along with Lahil and other fugitive leaders, boarded and finally escaped to the safety of France. He would never set foot in Scotland again. The rebellion he started had ended in disaster for the people who fought it, but his own miraculous escape cemented him as Bonnie Prince Charlie, the tragic romantic hero of a lost cause. The defeat at Culloden was not the end of the suffering for the Highlands. It was merely the beginning of a new phase of terror. With the prince a fugitive and the Jacobite army scattered, the Duke of Cumberland unleashed a systematic campaign of repression across the region, designed not just to punish the rebels, but to break the spirit of the Highlander people and destroy their ability to ever rise in arms again. This policy, known as the pacification of the Highlands, was in reality a campaign of state-sponsored terror. Soon after the battle, Cumberland established his headquarters at Fort Augustus in the heart of the Great Glen, and from there he dispatched detachments of troops into what became known as the harrying of the Glens. These redcoat patrols had broad and brutal orders. They marched through the territories of the rebel-clansed Camerons, the MacDonalds of Keppoch, the Frasers, the Chisholmsworth, fire and sword. Entire villages were torched, the stone and turf blackhouses reduced to smoking ruins. Crops were burned in the fields. But the most important target was cattle. As cattle were the primary source of wealth and sustenance, their mass confiscation was a devastating economic weapon. Tens of thousands of head of cattle were seized and driven south, leaving the communities without food, without milk, and without a means of survival. Famine, which was already a threat, became a certainty. Women, children, and the elderly were left to starve amidst the ruins of their homes, an act of collective punishment that made no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. The hunt for the men who had fought in the rebellion was relentless. Those captured were often executed on the spot without trial. Many were simply shot or hanged from the nearest tree. For the prisoners who were taken away, the fate was equally grim. The jails throughout Scotland and England were filled to overflowing. Overcrowded, unsanitary prison ships were anchored in rivers like the Thames, where conditions were so appalling that prisoners died in droves from typhus, dysentery, and malnutrition. Some 3,500 Jacobites were formally indicted for treason. Trials were held in Carlisle, York, and London. About 120 men were publicly executed, usually by being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a barbaric, medieval method of execution designed to terrorize. The heads of executed nobles, like the elderly and cunning Fraser chief Lord Lovat, were displayed on spikes in public places as a grim warning. For the majority of prisoners, however, the sentence was not death, but exile. Nearly 1,000 men were transported to the British colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean to work as indentured servants, a sentence of slavery for a fixed term. This policy served a dual purpose. It removed the most rebellious men from Scotland and provided cheap labor for the colonial plantations. The savage repression lasted for months, turning the Highlands into a military occupation zone. Civil authority was suspended and martial law prevailed. It was a deliberate campaign to dismantle the social and economic structure that had sustained the rebellion. The goal was not just justice, however brutal, but the complete transformation of a society. The British government was determined to ensure that the warrior culture of the clans was ripped out by the root, so that it could never again threaten the Hanoverian crown. The physical violence was just the first step in a much deeper process of social engineering. After the physical repression had crushed military resistance, the British government turned its attention to a more lasting weapon, the law. The objective was to perform radical cultural surgery to excise the very symbols and institutions that defined Highlander identity. In 1746, the Parliament in London passed a series of punitive laws, collectively known as the Act of Prescription. These laws targeted not just individuals, but an entire way of life. They represented the most direct and comprehensive assault on Gaelic culture ever undertaken. The first and most immediate measure was the Disarming Act. While previous laws had attempted to disarm the clans, this one was enforced with unprecedented ferocity. The ownership of any weapon, including the traditional broadsword, tarred shield, and dirk, became a serious crime. Soldiers conducted rigorous searches, confiscating entire arsenals that had been the heritage and pride of generations. The act effectively neutered the warrior culture of the clans, removing the means by which they had projected power and defended their honor. The most famous and symbolically potent of all the prescriptions was the Dress Act of 1746. This law made it illegal for any man or boy, with the exception of those serving in the British Army, to wear the Highland garb. This specifically included the kilt, the pleated skirt, the plaid, the tartan cloak, and any other piece of tartan clothing. The tartan, the woolen cloth with its distinctive checked patterns known as sets, was more than just colorful fabric. Each pattern was associated with a specific clan or district, and was an immediate visual marker of identity and allegiance. To ban the tartan was like banning a nation's flag. The kilt, in turn, was the practical and versatile garment of the Highlander warrior, perfectly adapted to the rugged terrain and damp climate. To ban the dress was an act of cultural humiliation, an attempt to force Highlanders into the breeches of the lowlands, seen as a symbol of subservience and civility. The penalties were severe. A first offense resulted in 6 months imprisonment, a second in 7 years transportation to the colonies. The prescription extended to other pillars of Gaelic culture. Although the Great Highland bagpipe was not explicitly banned by the law, it was classified by the authorities as an instrument of war. Pipers captured during the rebellion were tried not as musicians but as combatants, and many were executed or transported. The music of the pipes, which had sounded the call to battle and celebrated the clan's history, was effectively silenced. Together, these prohibitions represented an attempt at large-scale social engineering. The government believed that by destroying the outward symbols of Highlander culture, they could break the inward spirit of rebellion and independence. They wanted to transform the Highlander from a warrior loyal to his chief into a compliant, trouser-wearing subject of the British king. For nearly 35 years, the Highland dress vanished from daily life, except in the Highland regiments of the British Army, where, ironically, it was preserved and transformed into a military uniform. The psychological impact of the prescription was profound. It was a declaration that Gaelic culture was inferior, barbaric, and illegal. It contributed to the erosion of cultural self-confidence and hastened the decline of the Gaelic language, even though the language itself was not banned. The death of the material culture was the prelude to the dismantling of the social structure that had supported it. The next attack would be aimed at the very heart of the clan system, the power of the chiefs. With their weapons confiscated and their culture proscribed, the British government delivered the final and most structural blow to the old Highland way of life. The target was the very institution that formed the backbone of Highlander society, the power of the clan chiefs. The Act of Prescription had attacked the symbols, but the Heritable Jurisdictions Act of 1747 attacked the substance of power. This law abolished the hereditary, judicial, and military rights that clan chiefs and other major Scottish landowners held. For centuries, the chief was not just the patriarchal figure of his clan, he was the law. He presided over his own courts, with the power to judge everything from minor disputes over cattle to cases of murder. He had the power to summon his men to war, the so-called hosting and hunting. This legal and military authority was the bedrock of his power. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act transferred all these powers to the central state and its appointed courts. The chief was legally stripped of his functions as judge and general. In one stroke, the law transformed the chief from a leader of his people into a mere landlord in the British sense of the word. The ancient relationship based on mutual loyalty and kinship, the concept of duchdom, was replaced by a purely economic and contractual relationship between landlord and tenant. A chief's worth was no longer measured by the number of men he could lead into battle, but by the cash income his lands could generate. The old social contract was broken. The chief no longer needed the military loyalty of his clansmen for his protection, and the clansmen could no longer look to their chief for justice or leadership in time of war. This fundamental change in the nature of leadership had profound and devastating consequences. Many chiefs, especially the new generation who had not lived under the old system, adapted quickly to their new reality. They began to see themselves less as guardians of their people and more as businessmen whose lands were an asset to be exploited for maximum profit. Many were educated in English schools, adopted the lifestyle of the British aristocracy, and spent more and more time in London or Edinburgh. Their mounting debts, often incurred to support a lavish lifestyle, pressured them to extract more income from their estates. The old system of tenancy, where rents were low and paid partly in military service, became obsolete. Rents began to rise steeply, and tenants who could not pay were simply evicted. The transformation of the clan chief into a landlord set the stage for the next great tragedy of the Highlands, the clearances. The bond of trust and mutual obligation that had held clan society together for centuries was legally severed. The British government, by destroying the power of the chiefs, believed it was removing the structure that fostered rebellion. So what they did, whether inadvertently or not, was destroy the social safety net that, for all its flaws, had guaranteed the people a place on the land of their ancestors. With the chiefs turned into landlords and the clansmen into mere tenants, the people were left vulnerable to the impersonal forces of the market economy. Loyalty could no longer pay the rent, and when a more profitable opportunity than people arose, there would be nothing left to stop them from being swept from the land. The legal end of the clan system was not just the end of an era, it was the beginning of an exodus. Amidst the documented history of repression and legal change, legends and fragments of folklore persist that, though unproven, capture the bitterness and trauma of the era. One of the most enduring and enigmatic of these legends is the association of the Nine of Diamonds playing card with the curse of Scotland. To this day, in certain parts of Scotland, the card is considered an ill omen, a silent symbol of a national tragedy. The exact origin of this superstition is obscure, lost in the mists of time, and various theories compete to explain why this particular card carries such a heavy burden. The most famous and dramatic of these explanations is directly tied to the events that followed the Battle of Culloden. The story, as it is told, claims that on the night after the battle, the Duke of Cumberland, looking for a way to formalize his brutal order of no quarter, grabbed the first thing he could find to write on. On the back of a playing card, a 9 of diamonds supposedly scrawled the order that condemned the wounded Highlanders to massacre. The image of an order of extermination written casually on the back of a playing card, an object associated with leisure and games, perfectly encapsulates the cold, dismissive cruelty attributed to the butcher. The card, stained by this association, became forever a symbol of that act of barbarity. However, it is crucial to stress that there is absolutely no historical evidence to support this version of events. It is almost certainly a later invention, a piece of anti-Cumberland folklore that took on a life of its own. Historians point to several other possible origins for the Curse of Scotland, some of which predate Culloden by decades or even centuries. One popular theory links the card to the massacre of Glencoe in 1692. The story goes that Sir John Dalrymple, the Master of Stair, who orchestrated the massacre, had a family coat of arms that resembled the pattern on the 9 of diamonds. Thus, the card became associated with the treachery and cold-blooded murder of the MacDonalds of Glencoe. Another explanation traces back to a 17th century card game called Pope Joan, in which the 9 of diamonds was the most important card and was nicknamed the Pope, making it unpopular in staunchly Presbyterian, anti-Catholic Scotland. A more pragmatic theory suggests the curse refers to a robbery scheme. In the 18th century, a notorious Scottish highwayman allegedly stole 9 diamonds from a noblewoman in Edinburgh, leaving behind only the playing card as his calling card. Regardless of its true origin, the legend connecting it to Cumberland and Culloden is the one that endures most strongly in the popular imagination. The historical truth of the story matters less than the emotional truth it represents. The Curse of Scotland serves as a powerful folkloric reminder of the deep trauma inflicted on the Highlands. It functions as a cipher, a secret code for a national pain, turning an everyday object into a silent memorial for a massacre. It is a testament to how societies process tragedy, weaving their grief into the fabric of their culture, their superstitions, and their stories, ensuring that even if official history forgets, the people remember. The laws that dismantled the clan system did not create a vacuum. They cleared the way for a new economic order, one driven not by loyalty or tradition, but by the cold logic of profit. The chief turned landlord, often in debt and eager to emulate the lifestyle of the southern aristocracy, began to look at his lands not as a home for his people, but as an asset to be optimized. And at the turn of the 18th to the 19th century, a new and voracious economic creature began to spread across the hills and glens of the Highlands: the sheep. Not the small, hardy native sheep the Highlanders had raised for centuries, but new, larger, and more productive breeds like the Cheviot and the Blackface, bred specifically for the quality of their wool and meat to feed the growing industrial revolution in Britain. The age of the sheep marked the final transformation of the Highlands. The industrialists in the booming cities of Glasgow and the north of England had an insatiable demand for wool for their textile mills. Highland landowners quickly realized they could make far greater profits by leasing vast tracts of land to a single sheep farmer from the south than by collecting rents from hundreds of small tenants. Sheep were, in the words of one observer, the cattle with the golden fleece. The math was simple and brutal. A single shepherd could manage a flock that grazed on land that once supported dozens of families. The people who for centuries had been a chief's main asset had become an obstacle to profit. The system of communal farming that had sustained the population for generations, with its common grazing lands and run-rig fields, was incompatible with large-scale sheep farming. Sheep needed vast, uninterrupted ranges of pasture. To create these great sheep farms, the landowners needed to clear the land of its human inhabitants. The process was gradual at first, but it accelerated dramatically in the late 18th century and peaked in the first half of the 19th. The landowners, or their factors' estate managers, began to refuse to renew the leases of the families. Rents were raised to impossible levels, forcing people out. The common grazing lands were enclosed and privatized. Many landowners tried to justify their actions with the rhetoric of agricultural improvement and progress. They argued they were modernizing a backward region and making the land more productive. In some cases, they offered alternative plots of land for the displaced families, usually on barren coastal areas, where they were expected to adapt to a new life as fishermen or kelp gatherers for the chemical industry. These new settlements, or crofts, were often too small to support a family, forcing the men to seek seasonal work far from home. But in many other cases, no provision was made at all. The people were simply told their services were no longer required, and that they must leave the lands their families had inhabited for longer than any written record could remember. The new economy had no place for the old social contract. The sound that began to dominate the Highland glens was no longer that of human voices or bagpipes, but the ceaseless bleating of thousands of sheep, the heralds of a new age and of a mass human displacement. The Highland clearances were not a single event, but a series of mass evictions that took place over a period of roughly 100 years, from about 1750 to 1860. The term clearance is itself a sterile euphemism for a process that was, for the people who lived through it, an experience of trauma, violence, and profound loss. It was the final, most painful act in the dismantling of Gaelic society. The early clearances were, in some ways, the most shocking, as they were often perpetrated by the descendants of the clan chiefs themselves, the very men whose ancestors had led the people in battle and pledged them protection. Now, armed with British law and driven by market economics, they turned on their own people. One of the most notorious and well-documented of the early clearances occurred on the estates of Elizabeth Gordon, the Countess of Sutherland, and her husband, the immensely wealthy Marquis of Stafford, later the first Duke of Sutherland. Between 1811 and 1821, their estate managers, James Locke and Patrick Seller, embarked on an ambitious and ruthless program of improvement. Their plan was to move the inland population, who practiced subsistence farming, to the coast and to turn the inland straths into vast, profitable sheep farms. The process was carried out with brutal efficiency. Eviction notices were served on thousands of families, giving them little time to leave the homes that had been occupied by their families for centuries. When the people were reluctant to leave, eviction parties were sent in. These parties, often made up of other Scotsmen, were tasked with physically removing the people and ensuring they could not return. The tactics were cruel. Families' possessions were thrown outside. In many cases, the roof timbers, the most valuable part of a black house, were pulled down and destroyed to make the house uninhabitable. The most common and terrifying method, however, was fire. After the occupants were forced out, their thatched homes were set ablaze. The flames that consumed the houses were a visible and unambiguous sign that the old way of life was over. Eyewitness and later accounts describe scenes of absolute despair, women and children weeping as they watched their homes burn, and the old and sick being carried from their beds to die in the open. Patrick Seller, in particular, became a figure of lasting infamy for the ferocity with which he carried out the evictions in the valley of Strathnever. He was charged with culpable homicide after an elderly woman died after her house was set on fire, though he was later acquitted by a jury of his peers. The Sutherland clearances were perhaps the most famous, but the pattern was repeated all over the Highlands. Glengarry, the MacDonald chief, went bankrupt and sold his lands, but not before evicting hundreds of his own kinsmen. On Skye, Arran, the Hebrides, and across the mainland, people were forced from the fertile inland glens to the rocky coasts or onto immigrant ships. This first wave of clearances was a profound act of betrayal. It was the final breaking of the ancient pact, The people were not being driven out by a foreign conqueror, but by those who carried the names of their former protectors. The fire that burned the black houses also consumed the last vestiges of the loyalty that had once defined the world of the clans. To understand the true depth of the trauma of the Highland clearances, one must move beyond the statistics and economic analysis and delve into the human experiences of those who were evicted. The scenes of eviction, as they were described by horrified witnesses, were dramas of despair and helplessness that played out in glens all across Scotland. Picture a typical day of eviction. It began with the arrival of the landlord's party, usually led by the factor and accompanied by sheriff's officers and men hired for the dirty work. They would arrive at a clachan, a small village where the removal notices had already expired. The community's reaction was one of paralyzing shock and deep sorrow. The occupants were ordered to leave immediately. Physical resistance was rare and almost always futile against the legal authority and force of the eviction party. A family's possessions accumulated over generations, few pieces of wooden furniture, the cooking pots, the hand-woven blankets, the grandmother's spinning wheelware brutally thrown out into the mud. The scene was one of chaos and humiliation. Children cried, clinging to their mother's skirts, while the men watched, their faces a mask of powerless rage. Any man who protested was threatened with arrest or violence. They, who were descended from a long line of warriors, were reduced to spectators at the destruction of their own homes. The cruelest and most definitive act was the destruction of the house. The Black House, built of stone, turf, and timber, was more than a shelter. It was the center of family life, the place where children were born, the elderly died, and the stories were told. To ensure the family could not return, the house had to be made uninhabitable. Sometimes, a great wooden leva was used to bring down the stone walls. More commonly, the precious roof timbers, the hardest part to replace, were ripped out and broken. But the preferred method was fire. The torch was applied to the dry thatch roof, which would catch ablaze quickly. The families were forced to stand and watch as their home, with all its memories, was consumed by flames. The geologist and writer Hugh Miller, an eyewitness to the clearances in Sutherland, described the scene with haunting words. The smoke of the fire rose in dense, dingy columns. The stench of burning wool filled the air, and the shrill screams of the children and the barking of the terrified dogs mingled in a cacophony of misery. First-hand accounts, collected later, tell of the elderly and the sick being carried out in their blankets and left exposed to the elements, often dying of shock or exposure in the following days. Donald MacLeod, a stonemason from Sutherland who became a passionate chronicler of the brutality, described seeing old men of 80 and pregnant women left without shelter in the rain and snow. After the eviction party had passed, what remained was a landscape of desolation. The blackened ruins of houses dotted a now silent glen, where the only sound was the wind and, soon, the bleating of sheep. The evicted families were left to an uncertain fate. Some tried to build makeshift shelters on the beaches or moors, living in wretched conditions. Others began the long walk to the industrial cities of the south, like Glasgow, to join the ranks of the urban proletariat. And many, seeing no future for them in their homeland, looked across the sea. The scenes of eviction were not just the end of a tenancy. They were the erasure of a community, the destruction of a home, and the creation of a generation of refugees in their own country. Faced with the brutality and seeming inevitability of the clearances, the image that often emerges is one of a passive population, accepting its fate with a sad resignation. However, this picture is not entirely accurate. While large-scale military-style resistance was impossible in the aftermath of Culloden, there were numerous acts of local resistance, defiance, and protest. These revolts, though most often unsuccessful in stopping the evictions, are a crucial testament to the agency and indomitable spirit of the communities who refused to be erased without a fight. The nature of the resistance varied. Initially, it often took legal or peaceful forms. Communities would send petitions to the landowner, appealing to their sense of duty and the memory of the old clan relationship. Almost invariably, these petitions were ignored. When peaceful appeals failed, resistance became more direct. A common tactic was confrontation with the law officers in eviction parties. Entire communities, often led by women, would gather to block the path of officers coming to serve eviction notices. Armed with stones, sticks, and their own sheer determination, they would face down the men of the law. These events, known as the deforcement of officers, were illegal and dangerous acts, but they showed the community's refusal to cooperate with its own destruction. One of the most famous incidents of women-led resistance was the Rossshire Women's Riot in 1843, when a church minister was appointed against the will of the local congregation. The women of the community formed a human barrier to prevent him from entering the church, seeing the act as part of the oppressive system that was driving them from their lands. Another form of resistance was a direct attack on the symbol of their oppression, the sheep. In acts of nighttime sabotage, evicted tenants would attack the great flocks that now grazed on their former lands. Sheep were killed, their tendons were cut, or they were simply driven off into the mountains. In 1792, a series of protests in Rossshire became known as the Year of the Sheep. Thousands of people gathered and began to drive the sheep flocks south, attempting to expel them from the country. The government responded with military force, sending in troops to crush the rising. The leaders were arrested and transported, and the revolt was suppressed. However, the resistance faced insurmountable obstacles. The British state, with its legal and military apparatus, stood firmly on the side of the landowners, whose property rights were considered sacrosanct. Any resistance was treated not as a social protest, but as a criminal act. Leaders of the resistance were often arrested and given harsh sentences, including penal transportation. Furthermore, the traditional leadership of Highlander society, the old chiefs, were now the very perpetrators of the evictions. The people were without their natural leaders. The church, in many cases, also preached submission to authority and the acceptance of suffering as God's will. In the late 19th century, the nature of resistance changed, becoming more political. The Highland Land League was formed, inspired by similar movements in Ireland, and fought for tenancy rights and security of tenure. This political struggle eventually led to legal reforms, such as the Crofters Act of 1886, which finally granted some security to the small tenants. But for the tens of thousands who were evicted during the height of the clearances, these reforms came far too late. Their acts of defiance, though crushed, remain a moving reminder that they were not silent victims, but a people who fought against all odds to hold on to their land and their dignity. For the tens of thousands of families torn from their glens, the future presented itself as a grim choice between two unknown and frightening destinations: internal migration to the booming industrial cities, or immigration to the vast, distant colonies of the British Empire. Neither was an easy choice, and both represented a radical break with everything they had ever known. Many took the path south to the lowland cities like Glasgow, Dundee, and Paisley. They exchanged the clean air and open spaces of their homes for overcrowded, unsanitary, and disease-ridden tenements, lacking the skills needed for the new industrial economy. These Gaelic speakers were often relegated to the most grueling and lowest-paying jobs in the textile mills, shipyards, and mines. They faced poverty, alcoholism, and prejudice from a lowland population that often viewed them as uncouth and backward. They became an uprooted proletariat, living in miserable conditions, with their language and culture rapidly eroding in the anonymous melting pot of the industrial city. For many others, the thought of remaining in Britain was unbearable. They looked across the ocean to the promised lands of Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. As their only hope of rebuilding their lives and owning a piece of land, immigration took many forms. Some were able to pay their own passage, selling what little they had left. Others went as indentured servants. And many were the victims of assisted immigration schemes in which landowners, eager to rid themselves of what they considered a surplus population, would pay the passage of their former tenants. Though presented as an act of philanthropy, it was often the cheapest way to clear the land permanently. The journey itself was a terrible ordeal. The immigrants were herded onto immigrant ships, often nicknamed coffin ships, which were frequently timber cargo vessels, poorly refitted for human passengers. The conditions on board were atrocious. Hundreds of people were crammed into dark, airless bunks in the ship's hold, with inadequate sanitation and poor quality food and water. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and smallpox spread rapidly in such conditions, and the mortality rates during the Atlantic crossing, which could last for weeks or even months, were horrifically high. Many who embarked from Scotland never reached their destination, their bodies committed to a grave at sea. Upon arrival in the New World, the challenges continued. They would land at ports like Pictou, Nova Scotia, or Quebec, often penniless and not knowing where to turn. They faced the daunting task of traveling inland and carving farms out of the virgin forest. The work was incredibly arduous, and the first few years were a constant struggle against the wilderness, the harsh winters, and isolation. Yet, despite the hardships, they persevered. They brought with them their culture, their music, their faith, and their Gaelic language. In places like Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, Eastern Ontario, and Prince Edward Island in Canada, they formed cohesive Gaelic communities, recreating a piece of the Highlands in the North American wilderness. They gave familiar names to their new homes: Glengarry, Sutherland, Inverness. The forced immigration was a tragedy born of greed and oppression, but it was also the beginning of a new story. The journey in the coffin ships was the painful birth of the Gaelic Diaspora, a people scattered across the world, but who would never completely forget the misty glens they had been forced to leave behind. The forced dispersal of the Highlanders, though born of tragedy, had an unforeseen and lasting consequence: the creation of a global Gaelic diaspora. The men and women who were swept from their lands did not arrive on the shores of Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand as blank slates. They carried with them an immensely rich cultural baggage: their language, their music, their faith, their stories, and a deep sense of identity and community. In the new worlds they were pushed into, they did not just survive. They recreated and adapted their culture, planting the seeds of Scottish identity across the globe. Canada, in particular, became the primary destination and the refuge of the displaced Gaelic culture. Entire provinces, especially Nova Scotia, literally New Scotland, Prince Edward Island, and Eastern Ontario, notably Glengarry County, became hotbeds of Highlander settlement. On Cape Breton Island, Nova Scotia, Gaelic culture not only survived but thrived in a way that became, in some respects, more preserved than in Scotland itself. Isolated and forming dense communities, the immigrants continued to speak Gaelic as their primary language for generations. Fiddle and pipe music, dancing, and storytelling continued to be the center of social life. Dialects and musical traditions that were fading in Scotland were kept alive in Cape Breton. To this day, the region is a vibrant center of Gaelic culture, home to the only Gaelic College of Arts and Crafts in North America. Likewise, in Glengarry County, Ontario, the evicted MacDonalds and other clans established a robust community that holds the annual Glengarry Highland Games, one of the largest and most famous gatherings of its kind in the world. In the United States, Highland immigrants spread out more widely but still left an indelible mark. Many went south to the Carolinas, where they played a complex and sometimes contradictory role in the American Revolution, with some, ironically, fighting as loyalists for the British king who had oppressed their parents. Others moved into the interior to Appalachia, where their folk music and storytelling traditions blended with other cultures to help form the bedrock of American country and bluegrass music. In Australia and New Zealand, Scots, including many Highlanders, were instrumental in the settlement and development of those nations, becoming farmers, politicians, and entrepreneurs. Cities like Dunedin in New Zealand, whose name is the Gaelic for Edinburgh, pride themselves on their Scottish heritage. This global diaspora had a feedback effect. As the immigrant communities prospered, they maintained a sentimental and sometimes financial connection to the old country. The preservation of the culture abroad helped to keep the flame of Gaelic identity alive, even when it was under pressure in Scotland itself. The Highland Games, the pipe band competitions, the clan societies, and the Tartan festivals that are today celebrated from Grandfather Mountain, North Carolina, to Waipu, New Zealand, are all modern manifestations of this diaspora. They transform the Highlander identity from something tied to a specific place into a global cultural identity. The tragedy of the clearances emptied the glens, but in doing so, it scattered the seeds of Gaelic culture to the four corners of the earth, creating a Scottish nation far larger than the one that could be contained within the borders of Scotland itself. The history of the Highlands in the 19th century is marked by one of the most poignant ironies in cultural history. While the clearances were reaching their peak and authentic Gaelic culture was fighting for survival, a sanitized, romanticized, and utterly fabricated version of Highlander culture was embraced and popularized by the very British aristocracy that had presided over its destruction. The symbols that had been outlawed as marks of barbarism and treason less than a century before were transformed into fashionable emblems of a nostalgic nobility and icons of Scottish and even British national identity. The catalyst for this transformation was largely the work of the lowland novelist and poet Sir Walter Scott. In novels like Waverley 1814 and Rob Roy 1817, Scott painted a picture of the Highlands of the past as a place of sublime landscapes, noble chiefs, and loyal, honorable warriors. Though his portrayals were complex, the popular impression they left was of a heroic and romantic world. Scott effectively recast the Highlanders from dangerous rebels into the tragic heroes of a bygone age. The turning point in the rehabilitation of the Highlander image was the 1822 visit of King George IV to Edinburgh. Masterfully orchestrated by Sir Walter Scott, it was the first visit by a reigning British monarch to Scotland in nearly 2 centuries. Scott stage-managed the event as a grand Tartan pageant, a gathering of the clans that in fact had little basis in historical reality. He encouraged everyone to wear the kilt and tartan, which had been unbanned in 1782 but were still not in common use. The king himself, a portly man, appeared in a lavishly short royal Stuart kilt over pink tights, a sight that was both magnificent and slightly ridiculous. The event, nicknamed the Tartan Frolic, was a resounding public relations success. It made tartan and the kilt not just acceptable, but chic. The wave of tartanry, or Highlandism, was brought to its zenith by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Victoria, who fell deeply in love with Scotland, purchased the Balmoral estate in the Highlands in 1852 and built a castle in the Scottish baronial style. She and Albert, dressed in specially designed tartans, decorated their interiors with Scottish themes and promoted the image of Scotland as a royal playground, a place of untouched natural beauty, ideal for deer stalking and salmon fishing. The Highlander culture was effectively domesticated. The clan warrior was replaced by the Gilia hunting and fishing guide, the clan chief by the noble owner of a sporting estate. The culture that had been an existential threat to the British state was repackaged as one of its most quaint and loyal ornaments. This romanticization served a political and cultural purpose. By co-opting the symbols of Highlander culture, the British elite could simultaneously celebrate a distinct Scottish identity within the empire, while conveniently ignoring the brutal history of repression and eviction. It was a way of expiating guilt without actually addressing the injustice. While the aristocracy played at being Highlanders in their hunting castles, the real people of the Highlands continued to struggle with poverty, to emigrate, or to live on precarious crofts. The irony was bitter. The kilt and tartan, once symbols of a living, dangerous culture, had become the fantasy costume of the rich and powerful, and the symbol of a Scotland that existed more in the romantic imagination than in lived reality. By the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the transformation journey of the Highlands was largely complete. The landscape that emerged from the smoke of Culloden and the flames of the clearances was one that would be, in many respects, unrecognizable to a Highlander from the early 18th century. The most visible and profound change was demographic. The glens, which had once housed vibrant, densely populated communities, were now eerily silent. The blackened ruins of black houses and villages, often hidden beneath an overgrowth of bracken and heather, were the only silent memorials to the people who had lived there. The population of the Highlands went into a steep and seemingly irreversible decline. The land no longer belonged to the people. It belonged to the sheep and the deer. Economically, the Highlands had become a periphery of the British industrial empire. The vast sheep farms that had driven the clearances went into decline. In the late 19th century, due to competition from imported wool from Australia and New Zealand, many of these estates were then converted into sporting estates for hunting and fishing, purchased by wealthy industrialists from the south who valued the region not for its agricultural productivity, but for its wild beauty and the opportunity for deer stalking and salmon fishing. The local economy became dependent on tourism and seasonal jobs as gillies and gamekeepers, serving the elite who now used the land as their playground. The old self-sufficiency had vanished, replaced by an economic dependence on the outside world. Politically, the region was fully integrated into the British state. The military threat of the clans was a distant memory, a romantic fantasy. The descendants of the Highlanders fought and died in great numbers, not against the redcoats, but wearing the red coat, in the Highland regiments of the British Army from Canada to India and South Africa, becoming one of the most famous and effective pillars of the very empire that had destroyed their homeland. However, the story does not end in complete desolation. While Gaelic culture in Scotland was severely weakened, it was not extinguished. In the remaining pockets, especially in the Western Isles, the Gaelic language and musical traditions survived, stubbornly passed down from generation to generation. The political struggle that began with the Highland Land League in the late 19th century resulted in reforms that gave some security to the crofters and began a long, slow reversal of the landowners' power. And as we have seen, the global diaspora kept the culture alive and vibrant around the world. In the 20th and 21st centuries, we have witnessed a resurgence and a re-evaluation of Gaelic culture and history within Scotland itself. There is a renewed effort to revitalize the Gaelic language through education, media, and the arts. The story of the clearances is now told not from the point of view of the improvers, but of the victims. The final landscape of the Highlands is therefore complex and contradictory. It is one of the most beautiful and least populated landscapes in Europe, a beauty that is itself a scar of history. It is a place of profound loss and persistent memory, but also a place of resilience and cultural rebirth. The journey of the Highlander, from the clan system to the global diaspora, is a saga of defeat and survival, of destruction and reinvention. A testament to the enduring power of culture to withstand even the most brutal of transformations. If this epic journey has moved you, consider subscribing for more stories that have shaped our world.